The next gland we're going to talk about is the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys, and it's made up of two sections, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Now, kind of like the pituitary gland, these two regions make completely different hormones, but those hormones both participate in dealing with stressful situations. So we'll talk about each of these regions, then we'll list the hormones that are produced and what they do. The adrenal cortex makes hormones called corticosteroids. It'll be easy to remember because court, and court. All of these terms have the word, or the, letters court in them. And the adrenal cortex produces a group of hormones called corticosteroids that are broken down into two different subgroups, mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids, one of the examples is aldosterone. It's not the only one that is included in this group, but it is one of them. Aldosterone, you already learned about this in the kidneys lecture, is a hormone that helps to ultimately retain water, increasing blood volume and increasing blood pressure. Glucocorticoids include one called cortisol. This is the main one. This is a big one in helping you deal with stressful situations. We'll talk about this one in a few slides. The adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. And as you know now, these two emulate the functions of adrenaline. So from the cortex, we have aldosterone. Aldosterone is produced in response to lowering of blood pressure for whatever reason, hemorrhaging, or let's just say diarrhea or vomiting. Whatever case is, you secrete aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to retain blood volume and therefore increase blood pressure. This is also going to stimulate the kidneys directly to reabsorb more sodium. If you remember from the kidneys PowerPoint, aldosterone is considered the salt-retaining hormone. If you retain salt, water is going to follow and therefore increasing blood volume and pressure. Cortisol is the most important glucocorticoid, and this hormone helps you deal with stressful situations by maintaining blood sugar levels so you can keep using glucose to produce ATP in places like your brain. Regulates metabolism, reduces inflammation, let's say you have an injury or a tear, and it helps with memory formulation. I think the most important characteristic of cortisol is that it maintains your blood glucose levels specifically for your brain's activity when you are in a very stressful or sympathetic nervous system response. The only bad thing about cortisol, and this will not be a surprise to most of you, is that cortisol, when secreted in very high quantities, actually suppresses your immune system. Have you ever noticed that whenever you're really stressed out for a long period of time, you end up catching a cold or the flu, you end up getting sick? Well, it's not a coincidence because cortisol, secreted at such high levels over a long period of time, will suppress your immune system, making it easier for you to catch some sort of virus or bacteria. Now, our regulation system for cortisol is called the HPA axis. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this will be a little bit of review, a little bit of new information. The review part is that the hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone to stimulate the anterior pituitary to make its hormone. The releasing hormone is called corticotropin releasing hormone. It stimulates the anterior pituitary to make adrenocorticotropic hormone. This hormone goes to the adrenal gland and stimulates the adrenal cortex to make cortisol. But once you make high enough quantities of this is going to negatively feed back to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus to downregulate their functions. This is called the HPA axis. Now, looking at the medulla, the adrenal medulla has a huge role in the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. In the adrenal medulla, if you see these little yellow circles, these are called medullary chromaffin cells. These medullary chromaffin cells are there to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. And because epinephrine and norepinephrine are amine hormones, they're like amino acid based hormones, they're considered hydrophilic and they can be stored in this region until needed. When the nervous system sends a signal for the sympathetic response, it stimulates secretion of epinephrine, norepinephrine directly into this blood vessel that comes into the middle of the adrenal gland. And so epinephrine and norepinephrine go into the blood. They travel eventually around to your heart or to your respiratory system or wherever else it needs to bind to a receptor to have an effect. Jumping back up to the brain just for a moment, we have what's called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is made up of cells called pinealocytes. These are very dense with calcium and they help produce melatonin. If any of you take melatonin supplements, melatonin is what regulates your sleep-wake cycle. Although you're supposed to produce it on your own, sometimes people have trouble producing this. The way you produce melatonin is with retinal feedback. So this is kind of a cool piece of information. Whenever light hits your retina, it's going to downregulate the production of melatonin because it's going to send a signal to your brain to say, hey, it's light outside. It must be daytime. We shouldn't sleep. So, lesson to be learned, the darker your room is, the more melatonin you'll make and the better you'll sleep. The next gland we're going to cover is the pancreas, and the pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions, which means it has a role in producing both enzymes as well as hormones. So the enzymatic function is under the exocrine function, and it's carried out by cells called acinar cells. This is the majority of the pancreas, and this is what makes those digestive juices we covered in the last section. The endocrine function is carried out by islet cells, also called Langerhans cells, and these are the cells that are responsible for secreting hormones. I'm going to give you the hormones these cells secrete along with their functions. There are 3 types of islet cells: alpha, beta, and delta. Alpha cells make a hormone called glucagon. The function of glucagon is to raise blood sugar. A lot of your sugar is stored in your liver. So when the alpha cells make glucagon, glucagon goes to the liver and tells the liver to secrete out some of the stored sugar. This will happen in cases where blood sugar levels drop. Beta cells produce insulin. Insulin is a hormone that helps to lower blood sugar by signaling the cells in your tissues to uptake that sugar from the blood. Now, many students just think that, oh, well, when there's sugar in the blood, the cells just are able to eat it. Well, not quite. Cells are really blind to glucose. Unless they're given the signal by insulin to say, hey, there's sugar present, you should definitely use a transporter to take it in, the cells wouldn't know to do it. The last type of cell is a delta cell, and delta cells secrete something called somatostatin. This hormone will inhibit both insulin and glucagon when you're at a regulated blood sugar level. So I consider somatostatin as our basal homeostatic sugar regulation hormone. This doesn't create changes in blood sugar level. This just maintains the blood sugar level. And all the way at the bottom, we have the gonads. We've got testes and ovaries. Both of these secrete steroid sex hormones we call androgens. Androgen is just the overall umbrella term meaning sex hormone. The male sex hormone is testosterone, and its job is twofold. Number 1, to help with sperm maturation and production. Number 2, to help maintain secondary sex characteristics like dense bones, lower pitch voice, coarser hair all over the body. The ovaries will also make an androgen, and the androgen here is estrogen. Estrogen is the primary female sex hormone, and estrogen's main job is to help with ovulation and ovary production. The second one in females is progesterone. Progesterone's job is not quite with eggs and ovarian cycles, but rather with the uterine cycle. Progesterone fluctuations cause the uterine walls to thicken and then shed out, so it is this hormone that really controls a woman's menstrual cycle. Now, although we have covered most of the endocrine glands and organs, there are a few that I haven't covered. For example, the heart. The heart is definitely by no means considered an endocrine gland, but it does secrete one hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. This hormone is secreted when blood pressure is very high. In the aorta and the carotid artery, you have baroreceptors that are constantly measuring blood pressure. If that blood pressure is much too high, or if the heart stretches out too much, the heart itself knows that that pressure is high or blood volume is too high. It will secrete ANP to go to the kidneys to tell the kidneys to secrete out more salt. If you secrete out more salt, what else will follow? Well, water will follow. So ANP essentially, ultimately, causes water excretion, lowering of blood volume, and therefore lowering of blood pressure. Now, the rest of this PowerPoint is not about glands. It's simply about talking about hormones, their chemistry a little bit, and how they use receptors. So, hormones are chemical messengers. These guys help with growth, metabolism, reproduction, and they act by doing three main things. Hormones can alter enzymatic rates. They can control movement of molecules across membranes, and they can regulate gene expression. This one's a really big one. Now, controlling hormones is another topic in and of itself. How do you make sure that you are able to downregulate hormones so that you don't overproduce them and you don't have them around when you don't need them? Well, there are 5 main ways. Make sure that you know these 5 ways. Hormones can end their signal by either number 1, just stopping production of the hormone. Number 2, manually degrade the hormone. 3, remove the hormone from the receptor. This is called downregulation. 4, take that receptor hormone complex altogether and get rid of it from the cell membrane. Number 5, deactivate the receptors. Remember, I don't care how much hormone you make, if you don't have the receptor for it, that hormone won't function. So a great way to stop a hormone's function is to get rid of the receptor. This specifically is called desensitization. So now we have 2 terms, downregulation and desensitization. Make sure you know the difference. Downregulation means removal of the hormone or the entire hormone receptor complex. Desensitization is just deactivation of the receptor or removal of just the receptor. Now, one rule about all hormones is that the only way they travel is through the blood. Think about it this way. The blood is predominantly water, which means it's polar hydrophilic. If you recall way in the beginning of this PowerPoint, under Endocrine 1, we gave you 3 classes of hormones: the amino acid hormone, the peptide hormone, and the steroid hormone. Amino acid hormones and peptide hormones are generally hydrophilic, so they're able to happily move in the blood and travel around. But steroid hormones are cholesterol-based. Cholesterol is like a fat-like molecule. It's hydrophobic. If a steroid hormone is hydrophobic, that means it's scared of water. Do you think it's going to happily travel through the blood, which is mostly water? Probably not. So what we're going to talk about is the 3 different types of hormones, the primary differences between these hormones, and how these hormones travel through the blood based off of their characteristics. The peptide hormone is first. These guys are hydrophilic, which means they have no problem getting through the hydrophilic water. But because they're hydrophilic, they're not able to move into cell membranes without some sort of transporter. Recall that the cell membrane is made out of a lipid bilayer. It is mostly lipids. And if you're hydrophilic, you're not going to get through that lipid bilayer without a receptor or some sort of transporter. So although peptide hormones are able to move through the blood without an issue, they do need a receptor to be able to send a signal to the cell. Now, once the hormone binds to the receptor, it's going to send a second messenger signal through the C-AMP messenger system you learned about in the beginning of the semester, and that'll create another downstream amplified signal within the cell. How do you produce peptide hormones? Well, it's just a peptide, right? It's just a protein. How do you make proteins? Well, same way as you make any other protein. Transcription and translation. This illustration starts where we already have done transcription and we have our mRNA transcript of the peptide hormone. The ribosome binds to the mRNA, comes to the ER, and starts building its protein into the ER, and that's translation. Through a process of modifications, it's going to eventually produce a mature hormone, which is in blue, to put into the blood and travel to the target. There are a few terms on here that I would like you to know, and I'm going to circle them for you. The initial hormone you produce is called a pre-pro hormone. Eventually, you'll get rid of the signal sequence, and then you'll turn into a prohormone. This prohormone will go through a series of modifications, packaging, tagging, and folding in the Golgi until at the end of it, you cleave off a few peptide fragments, creating an active hormone to travel in the blood. Again, why does this peptide hormone not need a special transporter molecule to move it through the blood? Because it's hydrophilic. Now, to go on way the other end of the spectrum, we've got steroid hormones, and these guys are hydrophobic. Because they're hydrophobic, they don't like water, and this creates a problem because your blood is mostly water. Hydrophobic steroid hormones, because they're hydrophobic, they're cholesterol-based. These guys are going to require transport proteins in the blood. They're almost like chaperones, and you'll see them on a coming illustration. But before we move on, I want to point something out to you. Steroid hormones, because they're cholesterol-based, that means they're created from the root of cholesterol. Here's the cholesterol molecule. You notice that it's aromatic, which means you have a few rings in here. You've got a few side groups over there. Compare the cholesterol structure to some main steroid hormones like aldosterone, cortisol, or estradiol, like estrogen. You see that it still has all of those aromatic groups. So they are truly cholesterol-based. Now, steroid hormones are able to bind to the chaperone proteins, and the chaperone proteins help to transport steroid hormones through the blood. But once you get to the cell, do you think you're going to require a receptor for steroid hormones? Or can the steroid hormone simply pass through the plasma membrane without a receptor or a transporter? Well, the term is here. It's able to just diffuse into the cytosol, go into the nucleus, because steroid hormones, again, are hydrophobic. Your plasma membrane is also hydrophobic. So like dissolves like, they're able to simply pass through one another. Because steroid hormones can so easily get into the nucleus, they are often used as transcription factors. They alter gene activity, so they're able to alter transcription and translation. But because they're steroid hormones, what ways do we have of controlling their function? Because you can't sequester the protein, which means you're not able to store them in any kind of vesicle, you have to have a way to control the steroid hormone function. There are two main ways here. Number one, a negative feedback loop. This is simply controlling how much of the hormone you produce. It is dependent upon how much you have currently in your blood, which will negatively feedback and tell that production to either stop or to increase. If you have enough hormone, it'll negatively feedback to tell the gland to stop producing that hormone. You can also use something called phosphorylation. If you recall in the beginning of this course, I told you that protein structure dictates protein function. This is the same thing for hormones. Hormone structure dictates hormone function. So if I add a phosphate group to a steroid hormone, I'm sure you can agree that we changed the structure. And therefore, we're going to have changed the function. If you phosphorylate steroid hormones, you're going to halt their function. So here's the illustration where you have the steroid hormone that has to be moved using a chaperone or a carrier protein. But once it gets to the destination, it drops off the steroid hormone, and the steroid hormone has no problem getting right in through the plasma membrane, in through the nuclear envelope, and binding into the DNA. However, what you will notice is that once that steroid hormone is in, it needs another chaperone protein. And again, in the nucleus, needs another chaperone protein. Why is that? Cytoplasm is made of mostly water. So although the steroid hormone gets through the membrane very easily, it has to have a receptor waiting for it on the inside to move it through the cytoplasm, and then it could eventually bind directly to the DNA. When these steroid hormones bind to DNA, they control or alter transcription and translation. They can either cause more production of a protein or a decreased production of the protein. The last one is called an amino acid hormone, and this is because they're made of amino acids. So I'm going to give you just a few examples. The first one is tyrosine. This is one of our amino acids. Now, if you recall, amino acids have a carbon center, an amino group, a carboxyl group, a hydrogen, and then an R group right here. By using the tyrosine amino acid, you're able to slightly change the side group formation and create different hormones like thyroid hormone, T3, T4, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. So tyrosine is quite an important amino acid to have in your body. The other amino acid that we use quite often is tryptophan. And tryptophan's base is used to create serotonin and melatonin, so the hormone for happiness and the hormone for sleep. That is the end of the hormones PowerPoint. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.